The palace smelled faintly of sandalwood and ink. You can almost imagine it now, a place too large for comfort, too polished for peace. The stone floors echoed every footstep, the painted screens whispered of gossip, and the lanterns, even at midday, gave off a light that was soft but suffocating. This was the inner court of the Han Dynasty, sometime in the 1st century CE, and for those within its walls, time was not a measure of days, but of favor. Lady Jen was not born to be noticed. Like most women in her position, her name survives only in fragments, half remembered in the footnotes of imperial records, or miscopied by court scribes. Her story is not one of power or rebellion. It is, rather, one of quiet endurance, of a woman folded into the machinery of empire. In that sense, she was entirely typical and entirely forgotten. The life of a concubine in imperial China was built on silence. The silence began in her girlhood, when she was taught not to speak out of turn, not but to look directly at men of higher rank, and not to express her own desires. It continued when she entered the palace, where even her laughter could be seen as a political gesture. In the Han Dynasty, the emperor might have hundreds, sometimes thousands of women within his palace. They were graded and ranked like silk, fine, delicate, but ultimately replaceable. To understand Lady Zhen's world, you have to understand the system that built it. The Han court was governed by ritual, by hierarchy, and by the slow, bureaucratic cruelty of Confucian order. Women were arranged within a strict ladder of titles. The empress, at the top, followed by consorts, concubines, and attendants. Each title came with its own prescribed garments, privileges, and forms of address. Even the number of candles allowed in one's chamber was determined by rank. For Lady Zhen, who entered the palace as a beautiful companion, Maren, her life was governed by an unspoken law of submission. Her every movement was watched by eunuchs men who had been mutilated to ensure loyalty to the emperor. These eunuchs kept records: who the emperor visited, how long he stayed, and what gifts he bestowed afterward. Even affection was bureaucratized. In the quiet hours of the night, when the wind moved through the palace corridors, Lady Zhen would wait, not for love, but for the rustle of silk that might signal a summons. The emperor's interest could raise her from obscurity to influence or cast her into the shadows of neglect. The women of the inner court were, in effect, political currency. A favored concubine could intercede on behalf of her family, secure positions for her relatives, and even influence imperial policy. But the moment favor shifted, those same relatives could be executed for imagined crimes. And so, the women learned to wait without hope, to speak without meaning, and to smile without reason. The palace was not merely a home, it was a world of ritualized isolation. Women were forbidden to leave the inner court without permission, and their lives were organized around daily ceremonies, morning greetings, offerings to ancestors, and lessons in etiquette or music. Even meals followed rigid order. The dishes were chosen not by preference, but by symbolic harmony. Sour for balance, sweet for virtue, bitter for endurance. Lady Zhen might have sat before her lacquered tray, lifting each morsel with precision, knowing that her own appetite was a form of danger. Gluttony was a sign of moral weakness. Too little appetite, a sign of despair. Either could be reported by a maid or eunuch. Her hair would have been arranged in elaborate coils, heavy with ornaments gold, jade, or tortoiseshell, depending on her standing that week. The weight of these decorations was literal. A court lady might wear more than 5 pounds of metal in her hair. Every strand was expected to be perfect. An errant hairpin could be interpreted as a sign of disrespect. All this beauty, all this precision, existed for a single purpose: to reflect the emperor's glory. You might imagine her standing before a bronze mirror, her face powdered white with ground rice, her lips painted in vermilion, her expression fixed in the practiced stillness of palace life. Outside, the The city of Chang'an thrived, merchants haggling in the markets, soldiers drilling in the courtyards, scholars debating Confucian texts. But inside, Lady Zhen's world narrowed to the quiet rustle of her silk sleeves. There was no laughter in the women's quarters, only polite amusement. There were no friendships, only alliances that shifted with the emperor's gaze. When a new concubine arrived, older ones would feign welcome while calculating her potential threat. The women's fates were bound not by sisterhood, but by competition. And yet, life within the palace had its dull, almost meditative rhythms. The concubines embroidered long hours by lamplight, their stitches forming dragons, clouds, or the endless knots of eternity. They played the zither or the flute, practiced calligraphy, and copied verses from the Book of Odes. The emperor valued refinement, and a concubine's talent might attract his attention as much as her beauty. For many, these quiet acts of artistry were their only escape, their only means of leaving a trace in a world that had already forgotten them. The bureaucracy of the Han court extended even into childbirth. When a concubine conceived, it became an affair of state. Midwives and physicians, all male eunuchs, recorded her condition. If she bore a son, her rank could rise. If a daughter, she might be quietly reassigned or ignored. But giving birth to an imperial heir was not always a blessing. Many concubines died young from childbirth, infection, or deliberate neglect by jealous rivals. The empress, threatened by these births, sometimes ordered the child's quiet disappearance. Officially, these deaths were natural. Lady Zhen's life, like so many others, would have been spent balancing obedience with fear. The emperor's presence, when it came, was brief and ceremonial. He would visit her chamber, accompanied by attendants bearing censers of burning amber. The visit itself was logged. Afterward, the bedding was collected and sealed proof of imperial purity. The following morning, eunuchs would bring her gifts: silk, pearls, or ointments scented with musk. Yet even in these moments of favor, there was anxiety. Too much eagerness could be seen as ambition. Too little enthusiasm might be taken as insult. The art of survival was in moderation, in speaking just enough, smiling just enough, existing just enough to avoid notice while not fading entirely. Outside the palace, the empire was vast. The Han court governed millions, its roads stretching from the Korean peninsula to the deserts of Central Asia. Taxes were collected, wars were waged, and scholars debated philosophy. Inside, time seemed to stand still. The concubines' world was insulated from the empire they helped sustain. But even in their isolation, these women carried political significance. Marriage alliances with noble families strengthened imperial ties, and concubines were often chosen from clans loyal to the throne. A concubine's failure or success could alter the fortunes of her entire lineage. Families competed to offer daughters, believing that palace life, even in servitude, was the highest honor. They rarely considered what it cost the women themselves. Imagine Lady Zhen on one of the long summer nights. The palace air thick with incense, the faint sound of the court musicians drifting from the distant banquet hall. She would have sat by her window lattice, watching the lanterns flicker against the garden pools. Perhaps she thought of her family faces she would never see again. Perhaps she wondered whether they still remembered her, or if her absence had already been folded into their routine of ritual, offerings. Outside her chamber, a maid might have passed silently, bowing before the door, her eyes lowered. Within these small gestures lay an entire world of control, an unending choreography of obedience. And yet, within the dullness of it all, something persisted. Beneath the layers of powder and etiquette, behind the phrases rehearsed for survival, there were moments of thought, of memory, of rebellion so small it could barely be named. A poem whispered to the night, a stitch deliberately misplaced in embroidery, a glance that lingered too long. For centuries, official historians dismissed the lives of concubines as trivial, their names omitted from the grand narratives of conquest and administration. But if you look closely, if you read the margins, the letters, the fragments, you begin to see that these trivial lives formed the pulse of the empire. They were the unseen machinery of dynastic continuity. Lady Jeanne's story may never be recovered in full. We can only reconstruct it from the silence left behind. And perhaps, in that silence, there is something more revealing than the chronicles of generals and emperors. Because what does it mean, really, to live a life where every gesture is recorded, and yet nothing of the self survives? Morning in the Han Palace began before sunrise. The first sound was always the rustle of silk, the slow, rhythmic sweep of attendants unrolling the day. Curtains were drawn aside, incense was lit, water basins, polished bronze mirrors, combs, and jade hairpins were laid out in perfect order. For Lady Jeanne, the ritual was the same each morning, but her mood shifted with the rhythm of the emperor's interest. Some mornings, her attendants moved with nervous haste, whispering reminders about proper greetings, posture, and the exact angle of her bow. On others, when weeks passed without a summons, they moved more slowly, their eyes avoiding hers. Favor was not a gift. It was a weather pattern, unpredictable, fleeting, and entirely beyond her control. The emperor, Liu Zhao, known formally as Emperor He of Han, was young when Lady Jeanne entered the palace. Barely in his 20s, his reign was dominated by the influence of his mother, the Empress, Dowager Dou, and by the powerful eunuch clans that surrounded him. Though the emperor's name was inscribed on every decree, it was often others who held the brush. Lady Jeanne's initial summons to his chambers had been an act of political convenience. Her family's distant relation to the influential Liang clan made her an acceptable, though unthreatening, choice for a new concubine. Her beauty was noted in court records as delicate and pale, a phrase that meant little, but served its bureaucratic purpose. Her first night with the emperor was described in the official registry of the inner court with detached precision. The emperor visited the beautiful companion Jeanne in the hall of clear fragrance. A single line, one among many. But for her, that line marked the beginning of something that would come to define and destroy her life. In the days that followed, she received gifts. Rolls of fine silk, a small golden hair ornament shaped like a phoenix, and a handful of perfumed sachets embroidered with the Imperial seal. The gifts were less important than what they represented: recognition. For the first time since entering the palace, her name was spoken aloud among the attendants. Favor, however, was a dangerous thing. It drew attention, and attention drew envy. Within the women's quarters, Lady Jeanne's rise did not go unnoticed. The other concubines, some older, some far more experienced in the politics of affection, began to whisper. Small gestures of courtesy turned brittle. Servants who once smiled at her now bowed too deeply or avoided her altogether. There were rumors, subtle and poisonous, about her family's ambitions, her supposed arrogance, even the tone of her laughter. The palace was a cage, and within it, every woman was both captive and competitor. Lady Jeanne learned quickly that power was maintained not through confrontation, but through restraint. She spoke little in public. When she was addressed, she bowed twice instead of once. When others mocked her embroidery or her calligraphy, she responded with practiced humility. But humility was not protection. The Empress, the official wife of the Emperor, had no son, and feared losing what little influence she still held. When she heard of Lady Jeanne's increasing favor, her jealousy took form in quiet decrees. A new roster of palace attendants was drawn up, and Lady Jeanne's servants, her only allies, were reassigned. Her chamber was moved from the inner corridor, near the Emperor's quarters, to a more remote wing of the palace. Nothing was said directly. That was the way of court politics, punishment disguised as procedure. In the months that followed, the emperor's visits grew less frequent. The court was preoccupied with rebellions in the western provinces, and the Empress Dowager's health began to fail. Ministers debated reforms. Eunuchs whispered in corridors. The affairs of the empire, wars, taxes, appointments blurred together in a steady hum of paperwork and ceremony. For the concubines, these shifts in distant politics were felt in the most personal of ways. A change in the emperor's mood could alter the rhythm of their days. Lady Jeanne waited. Her world shrank to the dimensions of her small chamber. She spent hours at her embroidery frame, her fingers pricking tiny drops of blood into silk. She copied poems from the Book of Songs, the ink smudging faintly under her hand. Sometimes she read aloud, her voice soft and deliberate, the words echoing through the empty hall. A modest maiden, cautious and mild. How bright her virtue, 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 her virtue. How pure her smile. The irony did not escape her. Every few weeks, an imperial physician would visit. He would check her pulse, note her complexion, and record the findings in a scroll that would be filed away in the archives. And then, one autumn evening, when the chrysanthemums were beginning to bloom, a eunuch appeared at her door. The emperor was calling for her. The summons came without warning, as it often did. Her attendants rushed to prepare her, a bath of rose water, fresh robes of pale blue silk, hair coiled high and fastened with jade pins. She was led through the corridors, each turned familiar yet distant after so many months of neglect. The emperor received her in the pavilion of tranquil harmony, a hall lit with hundreds of oil lamps. He looked older than she, remembered tired. His eyes shadowed. Their conversation was polite, formal, almost stilted. He asked about her well-being, her reading, her music. When he smiled, it was the practiced smile of a man surrounded by people who served, not spoke. For a brief moment, she thought favor might return. But favor, in the palace, was never a return, it was a test. Over the following weeks, she was summoned several more times. Each visit rekindled a faint hope, and then left her, emptier than before. She began to sense the pattern. He came not for companionship, but for distraction. Her presence filled the silence between matters of state. One night, as they shared tea, he asked her opinion on a poem by Sima Xiangru, a famous scholar. Surprised, she replied, with cautious thought, speaking of beauty as a mirror of transience. He listened, then nodded. But the next morning, she learned that her words had been repeated, misquoted, by another concubine at court. Soon it was rumored that she fancied herself a philosopher, that she had spoken too freely, that she lacked the modesty expected of her station. The court turned cold again. It was never the offense itself that mattered, but the perception of it. And perception, in the Han Palace, was a weapon sharper than any blade. By winter, her name had all but vanished from the emperor's daily records. The palace chroniclers stopped listing her among those granted favor. She knew what that meant. Women who faded from the registry were often reassigned to temple service or confined to the cold palace, a place of silent exile within the walls. The cold palace was neither cold nor grand. It was simply forgotten, a set of dim corridors where unwanted consorts were kept under quiet watch. They lived on modest rations, without servants, without visits, without even the comfort of ceremony. Some died there within months. Others lingered for years, their names erased from official memory. Lady Jeanne did not know if she would be sent there, but she began to prepare as though she would. She wrote letters she would never send, addressed to her family in distant Liang province. She burned them carefully, the ashes gathered in a porcelain bowl. She kept a small chest of her belongings, a broken hairpin, a comb, a faded ribbon, embroidered with her childhood name. Every object was a memory, and every memory a quiet act of defiance. By early spring, the Emperor had taken new favorites, younger, livelier, chosen from families that promised political advantage. The cycle of affection began again, as it always did, and yet, somewhere deep in the labyrinth of the palace, Lady Jeanne remained a shadow, a cautionary tale, a name whispered among the servants. They said she had once spoken a single sentence too boldly, and that sentence had sealed her fate. The truth, of course, was far less dramatic. She had simply ceased to matter. There is a peculiar cruelty in being forgotten. History often remembers those who fall by violence or scandal, but it is quieter, more insidious, to be erased by indifference. Lady Jeanne's story, like so many others, faded not through tragedy, but through neglect. And yet, she continued to live, to breathe, to wake each morning to the sound of the palace drums, marking the hours, to exist within the narrow space allowed to her. Perhaps she found solace in routine, the endless folding of silk, the copying of ancient texts, the predictable turning of seasons within the garden walls. Perhaps she began to see beauty in monotony, in the stillness that once felt like a prison. But even in her stillness, the machinery of empire moved around her. The emperor grew ill. The Empress Dowager's influence waned. Eunuchs plotted succession. Outside the walls, famine struck the northern provinces, and rebellions flared in distant commanderies. The palace itself was beginning to tremble, though those inside could not yet feel the cracks. In this moment, standing at the window of her chamber, Lady Jeanne might have looked at the reflection of lantern light on the pond below, and wondered, if the emperor fell, if the dynasty itself began to crumble, would her life finally mean something? It began, as such things often do, with whispers, soft, uncertain, and impossible to trace. Whispers that the emperor was ill, that his attendants had grown secretive, that the Empress Dowager's relatives were quietly seizing power again. The year was 106 CE. The great Han Palace, with its red pillars and golden roof tiles, still gleamed under the spring sun. But within its walls, the air was heavy with fear and uncertainty. Servants walked faster and spoke less. Eunuchs bowed lower. Courtiers avoided eye contact in the corridors. Lady Jeanne had grown accustomed to stillness. After years of silence and isolation, the small world of her chamber had become a kind of refuge. She no longer dreamed of imperial favor or recognition. Her days unfolded in careful repetition, morning prayers at the household altar, tea in measured sips, embroidery stretched taut beneath her fingers. Yet even she could sense the shift. The palace no longer sounded the same. There were fewer footsteps, fewer songs from the musicians' court, fewer carriages arriving at the gates. Something was changing slowly, invisibly, like silk unraveling one thread at a time. And then, one morning, a messenger came to her door. He was an old eunuch, one she remembered faintly from her earliest days in the palace. He bowed deeply and presented her with a sealed order. The wax bore the mark of the chamberlain of the imperial household. Lady Jeanne unrolled the scroll with trembling hands. It was not exile, nor punishment. It was a summons. She was to attend the emperor, who had fallen gravely ill. The Pavilion of Everlasting Peace was the largest and most opulent of the palace's halls. But on that day, it was strangely quiet. Heavy curtains dimmed the sunlight, and the air smelled of medicine and incense. The emperor lay on his couch, propped on silk cushions, his face pale and thin. He was not the young man she remembered. The vigor of youth had left him, replaced by a weariness that seemed to settle deep into his bones. Around him stood attendants, physicians, and the ever-present eunuchs who recorded every breath and gesture. When she entered, all fell silent. "Lady Jeanne," the emperor said weakly, his voice a whisper of silk over paper. It has been long. She bowed low, her forehead touching the floor. Yes, Your Majesty. He gestured for her to rise. Come closer. She approached cautiously, every movement deliberate. The court etiquette drilled into her years ago came back automatically. 3 steps. Pause. 2 steps. Bow. When she finally looked upon him, she saw not the ruler of the empire, but a man, frail, uncertain, perhaps afraid. His eyes, once sharp and restless, were clouded now with pain and regret. I have not forgotten you, he said softly, though I fear the world soon will. It was a strange thing to say, even for a dying emperor. She said nothing. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of chimes. The curtains stirred. Time seemed to slow. He spoke again, almost to himself. They will fight over the throne when I am gone. The empress, the ministers, the eunuchs, each will claim to act in my name. But tell me, Lady Jeanne. He turned his gaze toward her. Do you think any of them remember what this palace was built for? She hesitated. To answer truthfully could be dangerous, but to say nothing would be worse. In the end, she answered, as she always had, carefully, truthfully, but without ambition. This palace was built, she said, to hold the weight of heaven's mandate. But the weight has always rested on people, not walls. The emperor smiled faintly. You speak as if you were born a scholar. She lowered her eyes. No, Your Majesty. Only as one who has had much time to think. A long silence followed. The emperor seemed to drift in and out of sleep. When he spoke again, it was a whisper. When they write of me, he murmured, they will write of battles, of decrees, of my mother's regency. They will not write of this. He looked at her once more, his gaze steady despite his weakness. Remember, he said. Then he closed his eyes. Lady Jeanne was dismissed before nightfall. The emperor's attendants thanked her in the formal language of the court, but offered no explanation. She returned to her quarters, uncertain whether she had just witnessed a farewell or a moment of forgotten sentiment. Within days, the emperor was dead. The announcement came at dawn, delivered by a procession of officials who read the decree aloud through the palace courtyards. Every hall, every corridor, echoed with the same measured phrase. His Majesty, Emperor He of Han, has ascended to heaven. The mourning period began immediately. For the Empress, for the Dowager, for the court. Each act of grief was scripted and ranked. Women of the inner palace were expected to wail, to fast, to wear unbleached hemp. Every movement, even sorrow, was governed by regulation. Lady Jeanne performed her duties as required. She knelt, for hours, in the Hall of Ancestors, her knees aching against the cold stone floor. She did not cry, not because she lacked feeling, but because her tears had long since dried in silence. When the emperor's body was borne to his tomb outside Luoyang, the court reorganized itself with startling speed. New appointments were issued. The empress became Empress Dowager. The eunuchs who had served the emperor now pledged allegiance to the next heir, a child too young to understand the crown he inherited. And for Lady Jeanne, there was no place. In the restructured court, she was neither honored nor punished. She was simply forgotten again. The new dowager had no use for a woman associated with the late emperor's private life. Her name was removed from the inner registry and placed in the House of Still Women, a polite phrase for widowed consorts and dismissed companions. Her days became quieter than ever. She no longer had attendants. Her meals were simple steamed millet, boiled greens, and occasionally a small piece of fish. Her chamber grew dusty, its screens faded. Outside, the empire continued to turn. There were floods in the Yellow River Basin, famine in the north, and new tax edicts in the capital. The chronicles recorded these events with precision. They did not mention Lady Jeanne, but sometimes a scribe would pass her in the garden and bow awkwardly. Rumors persisted that the late emperor had spoken her name in his final hours, that he had said, "Remember." No one knew what it meant. Perhaps it meant nothing at all. And yet, the rumor endured. A year later, during a rare festival in the palace, a minor official tasked with cataloguing poetry discovered several unsigned verses hidden among old scrolls in the archives. The calligraphy was delicate, uncertain, but practiced. One poem, in particular, drew his attention. The wind moves through empty halls, yet no dust dares to settle. The garden blooms for no one, and the pond reflects no face. What is beauty when unseen? What is love when unspoken? The moon remembers, though the world forgets. He copied it, and in time, the poem was attributed to a forgotten lady of the Han court. Some said it was Lady Zhen's hand. Others dismissed it as apocryphal, but the words lingered, carried through generations of scholars who studied the minor poetry of forgotten women. It was, perhaps, the only trace she left behind. As centuries passed, the Han dynasty fell, and new dynasties rose. The palaces burned, were rebuilt, and burned again. The names of emperors, ministers, and generals filled volumes of history, but the women who had shared their walls remained footnotes half-remembered, often confused with one another, their identities blurred into archetypes. Lady Zhen became one of those shadows, known not for who she was, but for what she represented. The quiet endurance of a woman in a world designed to erase her. Modern historians still debate whether the poem is truly hers. The handwriting matches that of several early 2nd century concubines. The imagery reflects classical Han style. There is no definitive proof, but perhaps that uncertainty is fitting. After all, what did the emperor mean when he said "remember"? Was it a plea to history to keep alive a name destined to vanish? Or was it something else entirely? A wish that someone, somewhere, might one day see the humanity buried beneath the etiquette of empire. In the end, perhaps, it does not matter. Lady Zhen's life, like so many others, was unremarkable in the grand narrative of history. She held no power, commanded no armies, and left behind no descendants to carry her memory. And yet, in her quiet endurance, she reflected a truth as enduring as any empire, that history is not only the story of those who ruled, but also of those who endured their rule. If you close your eyes now, you can almost hear the faint echo of her world, the sound of silk, sleeves brushing against stone, the soft creak of a paper screen, the measured steps of a woman moving through the long corridors of the past. Her story does not end with triumph or tragedy. It ends with stillness. And perhaps that stillness is its own form of survival, because even if her name fades from memory, the world she lived in remains within us, in the rituals we keep, the hierarchies we inherit, the quiet endurance we still practice in our own ways. And so, as the last candle burns low in the Imperial chamber, and the palace drifts once again into silence, we might ask ourselves, the empire was built not on swords or marble, but on numbers. You can almost picture it now. The slow shuffle of sandals on stone, the smell of olive oil and ink, the sound of wooden tablets clacking shut. Somewhere in a provincial outpost of the Roman Empire, perhaps in Cappadocia, perhaps in Gaul, a man sits hunched over a wax tablet, squinting in the dim light of a smoking oil lamp. His name is Gaius Petronius Secundus, and his job, though no poet would ever sing of it, is to keep Rome alive through arithmetic. He is a tax collector, or publicanus, a small cog in the grand machine of empire. To the senators in Rome, men like Gaius are invisible, but to the villagers, farmers, and merchants of the provinces, he is the empire itself, its hand, its voice, its tally of everything owed. The Romans were proud of their systems. They recorded, catalogued, and counted the world into submission. The tax system was among their most sophisticated inventions, the hidden spine that held their vast territories together. For Gaius, this meant endless work. His day began at dawn, with the opening of the tabularium, the records office of the provincial treasury. The building itself was unimpressive. Whitewashed walls, tiled roof, a handful of clerks seated behind wooden benches. The air was always thick with the smell of beeswax from the writing tablets and the faint tang of sweat and oil from the men who worked long hours there. Each morning, he reviewed the tributa and vectigalia, the two great pillars of Roman taxation. The tributa was the direct tax, what landowners, citizens, and subjects owed based on their property or poll count. The vectigalia was indirect duties on goods, tariffs at ports, tolls on roads, and fees for using public lands. Every number on his tablet was a life. Every sum of denarii reflected sweat, soil, and survival. The empire expected its dues with precision. The provincial governor demanded monthly summaries. The local magistrates required lists of delinquents. The praefectus annonae, the officer responsible for grain supply, needed forecasts of how much wheat could be seized for state use. All of it came through the tax collectors. The process was slow and exacting. Farmers would appear in his office carrying clay tablets marked with their census data, acreage, number of oxen, yield from the previous harvest. Each figure had to be copied by hand, verified against the previous year's record, and adjusted for new decrees from Rome. The decrees changed often. Augustus had reformed the system a century earlier, introducing uniform censuses and standardized rates. Since then, emperors had tweaked and adjusted the system endlessly. A single miscalculation could mean accusations of fraud, a death sentence, in an empire that prized accountability, at least on paper. So Gaius learned to write neatly, to calculate slowly, and to speak carefully. He had long ago stopped thinking of his work as moral or immoral. It was simply the order of things. The villagers, of course, hated him. When he arrived in the countryside, his arrival marked by the creak of a mule cart and the smell of dust, people locked their doors. Mothers gathered their children. Men lowered their heads. Gaius was polite, even deferential. But he knew the look in their eyes. Resentment mixed with fear. He collected grain, livestock, and coin, always accompanied by a small escort of soldiers. Sometimes, when the harvest had been poor, he allowed deferments. But the arrears accumulated interest, and interest was another form of punishment. He did not make the rules, he merely applied them. At night, back in his modest quarters, he would count his receipts under the light of his lamp. The flame flickered against the wax tablets, glinting off the small stylus knife he used to scrape errors. The air smelled faintly of vinegar from the ink he used to annotate parchment copies. Sometimes, he thought of Rome, a city he had never seen, but whose orders he followed as though they were divine. He imagined marble arches, golden statues, senators in white togas discussing numbers like his own. He wondered if they ever thought of the people behind the figures, the farmers who sold their daughters to pay a debt, the shepherds who fled into the hills to escape the census takers. Probably not. The Roman tax collector was part accountant, part bureaucrat, part scapegoat. He had no honor guard, no applause. When things went wrong, when rebellions broke out, when provinces defaulted, it was the publicani who were blamed first. But there was also a strange pride in it. Gaius knew that without his records, the empire would crumble. Roads, aqueducts, fortresses, all of it was paid for by his ledgers. His pen kept soldiers fed and cities supplied. His figures moved across the empire like blood through veins, invisible but essential. Still, it was lonely work. His colleagues were few. A handful of scribes, mostly freedmen or sons of lesser citizens, filled the office during the day. They talked quietly as they worked about the weather, the cost of oil, the latest rumor from the capital. Gossip traveled faster than official messages. There was one, Marcus the clerk, who often hummed to himself while writing. He claimed that keeping rhythm helped him remember the numbers. Gaius found it irritating at first, but grew to miss it on the rare days. Marcus was sent out on inspection duty. They shared a meal, most evenings, bread, olives, maybe a small dish of lentils. They ate in silence. There was nothing to celebrate, but nothing much to mourn either. Sometimes, the monotony was broken by an audit. The auditors came from Rome, bearing seals and self-importance. They asked endless questions, checked every line of the ledgers, and spoke of imperial efficiency. Gaius knew that efficiency meant fear, a missing sum, a discrepancy. Even a damaged wax tablet could be enough to trigger suspicion. One auditor, a young man with carefully oiled hair, once asked Gaius whether he ever grew bored. Gaius had smiled politely. "The Empire never sleeps," he said. "So neither can its numbers." The auditor laughed, but Gaius hadn't been joking. He sometimes dreamed of leaving, of returning to his family's small vineyard near Capua. But he knew too much to quit. The Empire didn't let its record keepers simply walk away. Knowledge, like wealth, was taxable, and so he stayed. In the evenings, when the air grew cool and the office emptied, he would light his lamp again and copy the day's totals onto parchment for the courier. He wrote in a steady hand, knowing the numbers would travel hundreds of miles to the archives in Antioch, then onward to Rome. Somewhere, in some grand marble chamber, another scribe would read them, file them, and never think of him again. And yet, every mark of his stylus was a trace of his life, proof that he had existed, that he had counted and been counted. Once, during an especially harsh winter, a farmer came to him with empty hands. His crops had failed. His sons were gone, conscripted into the army. He begged for leniency. Gaius listened, nodded, and marked a deferment in his ledger. It was all he could do. When the man left, Gaius sat for a long while, staring at the entry. Deferred. He had written in neat Latin script. It was such a small word, but behind it was an entire life, postponed hope, debt, and despair held in place by a line of ink. He closed the tablet and blew out his lamp. There is a certain beauty in boredom, if you look closely enough. The rhythm of ink, the repetition of numbers, the discipline of order. It gave shape to the chaos of empire. The Romans understood this instinctively. They built monuments to glory, but they survived through routine. For Gaius, that routine was his whole world. And yet, somewhere deep within him, a question stirred. A question that he could never voice aloud. If every life can be reduced to numbers, then who, in the end, will count the counters? Morning begins long before dawn in the provincial town of Caesarea Mazaca, where Gaius Petronius Secundus still lives among his wax tablets, his ink pots, and the soft creak of papyrus scrolls expanding in the night air. The oil lamp burns low on his table, its flame drawing lazy shadows across the walls. Outside, the streets are silent, except for the occasional bark of a stray dog. In the distance, temple bells sound faintly, marking the hours before sunrise. Gaius stretches, his back stiff from another night spent bent over records. The wax on his tablets has cooled unevenly, ridged with the marks of his stylus. He scrapes it smooth again with practiced patience. The Empire has sent new orders. Every few years, a census imperii is declared a full reckoning of the Empire's population, property, and productivity. These were the great counting rituals of Rome, performed not in temples, but in tabularia, through ink and sweat instead of sacrifice. The emperor, now Septimius Severus, desires precision. War in the East, he says, demands more revenue. New levies are to be imposed. and every estate must be reassessed. It means weeks of travel. Gaius packs his writing kit into a leather satchel. Stylus, sponge, knife, wax tablets, a small roll of parchment, and a sealed copy of the Imperial decree. He wears no armor, only a simple wool tunic beneath a brown cloak. The soldiers will accompany him 2 men, both veterans from the legions stationed nearby. Their presence is less for his safety and more for persuasion. The countryside beyond the town is dry and golden this time of year. The wheat fields shimmer in the morning sun, and the hills are dotted with low stone huts. Smoke curls from their roofs, thin trails rising into an otherwise perfect sky. It is easy, from a distance, to believe that the empire runs smoothly. It is only up close, among the farmers and shepherds, that Gaius sees the cracks in its order. At the first estate, an old man named Theon greets him warily. Theon's family has held the land since the days of Augustus. His hands are scarred from decades of ploughing, his back bent like a half-broken branch. "Another census," he mutters, after reading the decree. "We were counted 10 years ago. Nothing has changed." Gaius smiles politely. "The emperor requires accuracy, citizen. We all serve Rome in our own way." He begins measuring the fields, recording the number of olive trees, the condition of the soil, the count of livestock. Theon follows him silently, his jaw tight. When Gaius finishes, he hands the old man a wax tablet marked with the new assessment. "This seems higher," Theon says, squinting at the figures. "It reflects the current value of your land," Gaius replies, "and the new levy for the army." Theon sighs. "Rome takes the grain. Rome takes the coin. Will Rome take my breath next?" Gaius doesn't answer. He has heard this many times before. He has no authority to change the rates. His task is only to record. He nods once, respectfully, and moves on. Each farm tells the same story in different words. The drought has made the harvest thin. Some fields are fallow. Others have been seized by wealthy landowners, who lease them back to peasants at ruinous rates. Gaius records it all. He writes slowly, carefully, always checking the old ledgers for consistency. The smell of hot wax follows him everywhere. The soldiers grow restless. They mutter about the heat, about missing their rations in the city. At night, they camp beside the road, lighting small fires for warmth. Gaius keeps his lamp close, using its faint glow to update his reports. The soldiers sleep, their helmets glinting in the starlight. He looks up occasionally, at the night sky. The stars above the empire are the same everywhere, from Gaul to Egypt, from Britannia to Judea. Sometimes he wonders if any of the others doing his same job in those distant provinces feel the same weight. The quiet guilt of measuring lives for an empire that will never thank them. Back in the provincial capital, the tabularium hums with activity. New records flood in daily. Couriers arrive dusty and exhausted, bearing tablets bound with cord. Gaius takes his place among the other clerks. The room smells of parchment and sweat. Each desk is lit by a single lamp. The light wavers on the faces of the men, casting deep shadows under their eyes. They work silently. The only sound, the soft scratching of styluses, and the occasional scrape of a knife correcting a mistake. The ledgers grow heavier. Gaius's hand cramps, but he continues. He copies the day's totals into the master book columns of numbers representing thousands of lives. It is both satisfying and numbing. Once, he had dreamed of more. He had studied rhetoric in his youth, imagining himself as a lawyer or magistrate. But his father's debts bound him to the treasury. The irony is not lost on him. The son of a debtor, counting the debts of others. Rumors reach them one afternoon, a small uprising in a nearby district. Farmers have refused to pay the new taxes. Their leader, a former soldier, has gathered a few dozen men in protest. The governor orders an inquiry. Gaius is summoned to provide records of the region's arrears. He brings the ledgers, their edges darkened with handling, and lays them out before the governor, a rotund man in a crimson-bordered toga. These figures, the governor says, tapping the parchment, show the delinquents? Yes, Excellency. Mostly smallholders. Many are behind by less than 1 aureus. The governor frowns. A debt is a debt. If they will not pay, their land becomes state property. The law is clear. Of course, Gaius murmurs. He leaves the meeting numb. He knows what will follow: confiscations, arrests, perhaps even executions. And yet, none of it will be written in his hand. His ledgers will show only that the accounts were balanced. That night, he cannot sleep. The lamp flickers beside him, its flame bending in the breeze from the window. He opens the ledger again, staring at the neat lines of figures. They are so clean, so tidy. You would never guess that behind those numbers lie hunger, grief, and despair. He touches the stylus to the wax, then hesitates. What if he simply erased a name? What if he made one debt disappear? No one would notice. The empire would not crumble for lack of a few denarii. The thought lingers, dangerous and warm. He sets the stylus down. There are things even he does not dare. Days later, a courier brings news. The rebellion is over. The leader has been captured and executed. The rest have returned to their farms, poorer than before. Gaius receives new instructions: prepare the forfeited lands for reassignment. He dutifully marks each plot with a new owner's name, most of them wealthy citizens from the capital. The cycle continues. Still, something has changed in him. He finds himself looking differently at the records now. Where once he saw order, he now sees loss. Where once he saw precision, he now sees pain, neatly categorized. He wonders how many other clerks across the empire sit at their desks, feeling the same slow erosion of certainty. Weeks pass. The census is completed. The governor sends a report to Rome praising the efficiency of his administration. Bonuses are awarded to the treasury staff. Gaius receives a small sum enough to buy a better cloak for the coming winter. But the weight of the ledger remains. He has grown quiet, his colleagues notice. Marcus, the humming clerk, asks if he is ill. Gaius shakes his head. Just tired, he says. He begins spending his evenings walking along the city walls, looking out at the dark countryside beyond. The air smells of wood smoke and olive groves. He thinks about the farmers, about the rebellion, about the small defiance he almost committed. He thinks, too, about Rome, about the men who rule from marble halls and never see the fields that feed them. The empire, he realizes, is not made of stone or laws. It is made of people who obey. And when enough of them stop obeying, the numbers will stop adding up. One evening, a message arrives from the capital. Gaius is being transferred to Antioch, the great eastern hub of commerce. It is an honor, they say, a sign of trust. He knows better. It means more ledgers, more numbers, more sleepless nights. But he accepts. What else can he do? Before leaving, he visits the archives one last time. The shelves stretch endlessly, filled with tablets and scrolls, each marked with dates and sums. The smell of old ink and beeswax fills the air. He runs his fingers along the spines of the records he has written. They will outlive him. Long after he is dust, someone will open them, read the neat columns, and know nothing of the man who wrote them. He feels both pride and despair in that thought. As he closes the door behind him, the lamps flicker. The silence of the archive settles like dust on his skin. The empire will continue. The taxes will be collected. The ledgers will be written and rewritten. But sometimes, in the small hours of the night, Gaius wonders if the empire truly controls its people, or if, quietly, the people's obedience controls the empire. Antioch was vast beyond imagining. Gaius Petronius Secundus arrived at the city's gates in late summer. The sun, low and brilliant, burning the white stone walls to gold. Caravans moved slowly along the streets, loaded with silks, spices, and copper. the smell of olive oil mixed with the pungent tang of salt and fish from the harbour. For a man who had spent years among dry hills and scattered farms, the city seemed endless. An ocean of people, voices, and ledgers. He was assigned quarters near the Eastern Tabularium, a building of white marble with polished floors and bronze doors. Here, he would serve as one of the senior scribes, responsible for coordinating tax collection across the eastern provinces, a region stretching from Syria to Cappadocia, from the Mediterranean coast to the mountains that held the frontier. The responsibility was staggering. From the very first day, the weight of the empire pressed down on him. Couriers arrived with mountains of records, copies of censuses from hundreds of settlements, ledgers of tolls collected from roads and bridges, manifests from river ports, and the detailed account books of provincial magistrates. Every number represented a life, a family, a harvest, a debt. The tabularium was crowded, hot, and noisy. Clerks moved quickly, writing, calculating, copying. Others hummed, like Marcus had in the provincial capital. The air was dense with the smell of beeswax, ink, and the sweat of human effort. Gaius felt small among the records, but also, in a strange way, essential. Without his order, without his diligence, the province could not function. Soldiers would starve, cities would lack grain, Rome would know famine before it knew rebellion. He had moved from being a man who collected debts to a man who held the map of life itself in his hands. Days blurred together. He spent hours reconciling discrepancies between the reports of different districts, comparing one village's count of oxen with another's census record, adjusting for new imperial edicts on property taxation. Errors, even minor ones, could have enormous consequences. A misrecorded figure could lead to famine in a city that relied on accurate grain quotas. An uncollected tax could bankrupt a province. A false report could be seen as corruption, punishable by imprisonment or worse. And yet, in all his meticulous labour, Gaius sometimes caught glimpses of humanity. A clerk from Antioch, a young man named Lucius, brought him letters from villagers appealing for relief. Starving families, damaged crops, unexpected floods. Gaius read them carefully, noting which could be deferred, which could not. Sometimes, he used the tiniest discretion allowed to soften the blow. It was dangerous. Imperial auditors were always watching. But within the immense machinery of bureaucracy, a small act of mercy was invisible, like a single drop in the ocean. The weight of authority was not the only burden. Gaius watched as colleagues were accused of errors, sometimes rightly, sometimes unfairly. They were summoned to the governor's hall. Their ledgers examined under the scrutinizing eyes of auditors. Some were dismissed, others fined, and a few disappeared from records entirely. He realized that obedience was survival. Precision was survival. Silence, above all, was survival. Yet still, he felt the moral friction of his work. The empire existed because of human labor, human suffering, human compliance. Every column of figures represented something intimate, a life constrained by laws he enforced, often without empathy. He began to dream, not of leaving, but of the people behind the numbers. Each night, lying on a straw mattress in his small chamber, he imagined the fields stretching in distant villages, the smell of fresh soil, the laughter of children, and the despair of fathers forced to surrender their harvest. He wondered if they remembered him not as a man, but as the hand of the empire. Months passed. One day, an urgent report arrived. The governor demanded immediate reconciliation of the southern provinces. Raiders had attacked grain shipments along the Orontes River. Villagers were petitioning for relief. Soldiers were delayed. Gaius and his team worked for days without pause. The wax tablets grew thicker, the ink-stained fingers raw. Couriers arrived exhausted. Clerks collapsed from heat. Orders from Rome arrived faster than he could copy them, requiring recalculations and revisions. He realized that the empire's efficiency depended entirely on human endurance, on the ability of men like him to work until exhaustion became routine. And yet, it also depended on obscurity. The scribes, the clerks, the collectors, they were the bones beneath the visible structure, but they were rarely acknowledged. A few weeks later, a rare visitor appeared in the tabularium. A senator from Rome, accompanied by auditors and soldiers. They were inspecting the eastern provinces, checking for efficiency and compliance. He looked over the ledgers with sharp eyes, tracing each column with a long finger. "Well done," he said finally. "The accounts are in order. Everything is accounted for." The praise was brief, perfunctory, almost mechanical. Gaius bowed deeply. He felt a momentary flush of pride, quickly replaced by the weight of ongoing responsibility. The praise mattered little. The work never ended. As winter approached, the couriers returned with news of uprisings and famine in other provinces: Gaul, Hispania, Judea. Gaius's fingers traced the figures, tallying the losses and recalculating expected revenues. Each rebellion reminded him that the empire was fragile, held together only by obedience, order, and the meticulous recording of life's details. He thought of the farmers in Cappadocia, of Theon's stubborn face, of the debt deferred by a merciful hand. And he realized that the empire's greatness lay not in its armies or roads or aqueducts, but in the people who obeyed, who endured, and in the clerks who, through monotony and precision, translated human lives into manageable sums. One night, after the office had emptied, Gaius remained alone with his ledgers. The lamp flickered low, casting long shadows across the wax tablets. He traced the numbers with his stylus, carefully correcting minor errors. He thought about Rome, about the senators who never touched a field or a coin, about the emperor who ruled from marble halls. None of them knew him, nor would they, but he had left traces: his handwriting, his order, his tiny acts of discretion. They would persist long after he was gone. Perhaps a future clerk would notice an adjustment he made for a starving village. Perhaps someone, centuries from now, would find these wax tablets and wonder about the man who counted the empire. It was enough. And yet, the question haunted him. What if the people stop obeying? What if the empire, so dependent on numbers and compliance, falters because the humans behind the figures refuse to play their part? He had no answer. He only knew that, until the end, he would keep counting. Even as the empire swelled and contracted, as emperors came and went, as rebellions rose and fell, one truth remained: the world ran on invisible labor, on those who recorded, reconciled, and endured. And so, Gaius did his work, day after day, year after year, until he could no longer lift the stylus. When he finally passed from the world of living, the ledgers remained, untouched yet accurate, silently bearing witness to countless lives, debts, and harvests. No one celebrated him. No triumphs were recorded in marble or song. Yet the empire survived because he had served faithfully, unseen. In that silence, perhaps, there was dignity. Perhaps history was built not only by generals and senators, but by the quiet endurance of those who keep the ledgers, light the lamps, and count the empire, so that all others may continue. And in that enduring silence, one might ask, if the empire can be preserved by the unnoticed hands of a single clerk, then how many other empires, past or present, quietly survive because of lives never chronicled, never celebrated, never remembered? Before the sun rises over the fields of a medieval abbey, the monastery is already awake, not with the sound of bells or chanting, but with the subtle, almost imperceptible movements of preparation. In the large stone kitchen, at the heart of the abbey, a few figures stir quietly. Their footsteps echo on the cold flagstones, blending with the soft drip of water from a well-worn cistern. These are the kitchen monks, or conversi, men who have taken vows but whose daily labor is devoted to sustenance rather than scripture. They are rarely noted in chronicles. They are not the abbots, whose names are carved in wood or stone. They do not appear in letters to distant patrons. And yet, they hold the monastery together, day by day, meal by meal. In the kitchen, the scent of salt and fire fills the air. Large cauldrons hang over stone hearths, their contents simmering gently. Lentils, grains, soups, thick with herbs grown in the monastery gardens. The fire must be tended continuously. Ashes are shoveled, embers stoked, logs added in measured rotations. One monk watches the flame, another scrapes soot from the iron pots. Each motion is precise, learned through years of repetition. Dawn begins with the preparation of bread, the staple of every meal, wheat, rye, or barley depending on the season. And the abbey's wealth is ground into flour, mixed with water, sometimes a small amount of yeast, then kneaded into dough on broad wooden tables dusted with flour. Hands move rhythmically, pressing, folding, turning. The smell of fresh dough mingles with the lingering tang of yesterday's fires. Bread is more than sustenance. In a medieval monastery, it is central to survival. Meals are simple, and bread provides the foundation upon which all else rests. Every loaf is accounted for. Too few, and the monks in the dormitory will go hungry. Too many, and the abbey risks waste. Salt is added sparingly, a precious commodity that preserves and flavors. In winter, when meat is scarce and vegetables must be stored for months, salt transforms the mundane into sustenance that can endure. Monasteries often maintain elaborate stores of salt, traded or transported from distant coasts, guarded carefully in wooden chests. It is easy to underestimate its importance, but without it, a monastery could not survive the cold months. Once the bread is prepared, the kitchen monks turn to vegetables and legumes. In medieval Europe, monks cultivated extensive gardens. Carrots, leeks, onions, cabbages, and beans. Each requires its own preparation. Leaves are cleaned, roots scraped, beans shelled. Some vegetables are boiled, others are roasted in large clay ovens. Cooking times are precise, measured by the smell of the food, the texture, or the faint cracking of firewood. The monks work silently, the rhythm of their labor almost meditative. Conversation is minimal, reserved for instructions or emergencies. In many abbeys, silence is a formal rule, a practice designed to cultivate contemplation and focus. But in the kitchen, silence is also practical. A shouted instruction over the roar of a hearth could spill scalding broth, ruin a batch of bread, or start a fire. Meals themselves follow a strict schedule dictated by the rule of Saint Benedict, which governs most Western monasteries in this period. The day begins with matins and lauds, prayers held in the dark hours of the morning. By the time the monks return to their cells, the kitchen must be ready with breakfast. Bread, gruel, sometimes a bit of cheese, or a few fruits preserved from the previous harvest. Lunch, or prandium, is lighter. Bread, vegetables, perhaps a small portion of fish if available. Dinner, eaten after Vespers, is the main meal, simple but carefully prepared. Meat is rare, often reserved for special feast days. The kitchen monks, however, prepare the meals for hundreds of mouths novices, lay brothers, choir monks, guests, and sometimes pilgrims passing through. Each portion must be weighed, measured, and recorded. Errors are noted in the quiet ledger of the kitchen, as vital as any scroll in the abbey's library. Winter is the most demanding season. Food must be preserved for months. Root vegetables are buried in sand, pickled in brine, or stored in cool cellars. Grains are sifted and stacked in barrels. Cheese is salted and aged. Every step requires careful observation. One mistake could feed a month of hunger into weeks of famine. Firewood is another constant concern. The kitchen consumes it rapidly for boiling, baking, and heating. Monks spend hours hauling logs from the woodpile, splitting them into manageable sizes and keeping the fires at the correct temperature. Too hot and bread burns, too cool and soups fail to cook. Temperature control is a matter of intuition, gained over years of repetitive labor. In summer, the work shifts to fresh produce. Herbs must be harvested daily. Rosemary, sage, thyme, parsley. They are chopped, bundled, dried, or stored in earthen jars. These herbs not only flavor food, they preserve it, repel insects, and serve medicinal purposes. The kitchen is thus both a place of sustenance and a rudimentary pharmacy. Guests were another matter entirely. Monasteries, especially those along pilgrimage routes or major roads, often hosted outsiders. Hospitality was a sacred duty. The kitchen monks prepared extra meals, bread and ale, perhaps a stew of lentils with added spices if they could spare them. These meals were served with ceremony, ensuring that the abbey's reputation for piety and care remained intact. Yet for all this work, the monks themselves rarely ate luxuriously. Their diet was governed by austerity, simple, plain, and repetitive. Meals were eaten in silence, often with readings from scripture or hagiography spoken aloud by one of the senior monks. Flavor was secondary. Sustenance, ritual, and order were primary. The hierarchy of the kitchen mirrored the hierarchy of the monastery itself. A cellarer oversaw the supplies: grains, vegetables, salt, wine, and oil. He delegated tasks to novices and lay brothers who performed the heaviest labor, fetching water, hauling firewood, cleaning cauldrons, and scraping floors. Experienced kitchen monks managed the hearths, supervised cooking, and ensured the timing of meals. Mistakes were punished subtly, not with violence, but with censure, additional labor, or reassignment to less desirable duties. A spilled pot could mean hours of cleaning. Burned bread might result in early morning scrubbing of the cold stone floors. These punishments maintained discipline, but also reinforced the understanding that the monastery's survival depended on diligence. One of the most tedious but essential tasks was maintaining the salt supply. Salt was rare and valuable. In some monasteries, it was as carefully guarded as gold. Monks measured it precisely for each meal and for preserving food. They monitored humidity in storage cellars, moved barrels to prevent spoilage, and rationed it during shortages. The work was repetitive, dusty, and mind-numbingly slow. But without it, winter could bring malnutrition, disease, and even death. Similarly, water had to be managed with constant attention. Streams might dry, wells might become contaminated, and cisterns needed regular cleaning. Kitchens relied on these sources for drinking, washing, and cooking. One lapse could poison hundreds. Despite the tedium, there was an art to the labor. Timing had to be perfect. Bread needed hours to rise. Soups required precise intervals of time, simmering. Vegetables could not be overcooked, lest their nutrients be lost. Monks developed an almost instinctive understanding of heat, moisture, and weight. The work, though repetitive, honed patience, precision, and observation skills, not unlike those used in a scribe's careful copying of a manuscript. And as with a manuscript, the results were fleeting. Bread was eaten, stew consumed, vegetables boiled and gone. The labor was ephemeral, yet vital. The survival of hundreds depended upon it. Evenings brought their own rhythms. Fires had to be banked, cauldrons scrubbed, floors swept. The smell of smoke and salt lingered long after the kitchen was empty. Monks would reflect quietly on the day's work, meditate on their tasks, and prepare for another day at dawn. It was monotonous, uncelebrated, and utterly essential. History rarely records these moments. Chronicles speak of abbots, bishops, and battles, but the labour of the kitchen monks, the men who turned grain into sustenance and preserved life through long winters, remains largely invisible. Yet in this invisible labour, the monastery endured. The monks did not need recognition. Their lives were governed by rhythm, repetition, and devotion. Survival, after all, was sacred in its own right. And as the last fire burns down and the kitchen falls silent, one can almost imagine the lingering aroma of salt, bread, and herbs. The abbey rests in quiet expectation of dawn, knowing that the cycle will begin again, predictably, endlessly, and invisibly. For the kitchen monks, the day ends not in glory or reward, but in the quiet knowledge that tomorrow, as always, the empire of silence and salt will endure through their hands, their sweat, and their discipline. And yet, one might wonder, what do lives devoted entirely to sustenance, repetition, and ritual leave behind in the records of history? Can survival itself, achieved silently, ever be recognized? By mid-morning, the abbey is fully awake, though still cloaked in the soft light of high windows. The kitchen is a hive of quiet activity. Monks move between cauldrons and counters, carrying wooden bowls of grains, buckets of water, and freshly chopped herbs. Each movement is precise, rehearsed over countless mornings and evenings. The rule of Saint Benedict governs every action. Time is partitioned meticulously. Prayer, work, meals, study, and rest. The kitchen monks exist primarily in the domain of labour, and their days are measured by the heat of the hearth, the rising of dough, the simmering of lentils, and the arrival of the bell. Each monk knows his task. One maintains the fire, ensuring consistent heat. Another tends the cauldrons, stirring slowly to prevent scorching. Others prepare vegetables, peel root crops, and slice onions into thin, uniform strips. Even the simplest actions are ritualized. Cutting too thickly or stirring too rapidly is considered careless, not merely a lapse in technique, but a moral failing. The hearth is the heart of the kitchen. Fires are fed continuously, with logs hauled from the abbey woodpile. In winter, the cold can bite through thick wool tunics, and the heat of the kitchen becomes both refuge and tool. Monks monitor the flames with intense focus, aware that a mismanaged fire can destroy hours of labour or ruin a meal meant for hundreds. Bread baking is central to the day. Loaves are shaped, allowed to rise, scored with careful precision, and placed in the oven. The monk tending the fire must judge when the coals are ready, when the flames have died to a soft, consistent heat. Too hot, and the crust burns while the inside remains raw. Too cool, and the bread is dense and heavy. The simplicity of the task belies its difficulty. Each loaf is both sustenance and an exercise in discipline. Hundreds of loaves may be required for the abbey's daily meals, and failure is not an option. Vegetables and legumes provide nutrition and variety. Monks wash cabbages in cold water drawn from the abbey cistern, peel parsnips and carrots, and trim beans with patient precision. Every item is inspected for quality. Rotten leaves are discarded. Discoloured vegetables are set aside for later use in soups where appearance matters less. Herbs, parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme are washed, chopped, and bundled. Their fragrance fills the kitchen, mingling with smoke, salt, and the scent of simmering broth. Herbs serve multiple purposes: seasoning, preservation, and medicine. The monk's attention to detail in handling these plants ensures that meals are not only nourishing, but durable, able to sustain the community through long winters. Meals are assembled with equal care. Portions must be consistent. Bread is divided into standard slices. Soup is ladled into bowls with measured precision. Lentils and beans are counted, not in individual grains, but in scoops and ladles. Everything is noted in small, meticulous ledgers, often kept on wax tablets or parchment, recording quantities used, remaining supplies, and any spoilage. Efficiency is paramount. Supplies are limited, and mismanagement can have immediate consequences. Monks balance scarcity against necessity, calculating how many meals a store of flour will yield, how long salted fish will last, and how much water is needed for cooking and cleaning. Silence permeates the kitchen. Conversation is minimal. When spoken, it is quiet and deliberate, usually limited to instructions. The rule of Saint Benedict forbids idle chatter, and the monastery's hierarchy reinforces the practice. Silence allows concentration and prevents accidents, spilled soup, cut fingers, or scorched bread. Yet silence is not emptiness. It carries rhythm, a kind of music, born of repetition and routine. The scrape of knives on wooden tables, the splash of water, the crackle of fire, all become part of a subtle cadence. Monks develop an almost meditative awareness of these sounds, attuned to the kitchen in a way outsiders cannot perceive. The work is exhausting, both physically and mentally. Hours are spent bending over cauldrons, chopping vegetables, stirring thick stews, kneading dough, hauling water, and sweeping floors. Yet, each monk endures this labor with stoic patience. Physical fatigue is expected. It is a measure of dedication and a form of spiritual discipline. Even meals themselves are consumed simply and quickly. Bread, vegetables, and occasionally fish are eaten in silence, accompanied by brief readings from scripture. Flavors are secondary. Nourishment and rhythm are primary. The goal is to sustain the body while the mind attends to higher contemplation. Winter amplifies the demands. Preservation becomes central. Root vegetables must be stored in sand. Barreled grains monitored for moisture. Salted fish and meats checked daily for spoilage. Fires burn longer and hotter. Water freezes in cisterns. Every detail requires careful attention. One mistake could mean hunger or illness for dozens of monks, guests, or pilgrims. The kitchen is, in effect, the lifeline of the abbey. Its labor is invisible, repetitive, and utterly necessary. Without it, the monks could not pray, study, or fulfill the spiritual duties that define monastic life. Summer shifts the focus to fresh produce. Herbs are abundant, harvested daily for flavor and medicine. Vegetables are boiled, roasted, or eaten fresh, and surplus is preserved for winter through drying, salting, or pickling. Monks spend hours tending the gardens, ensuring that the kitchen receives a steady supply. Even the smallest task, the washing of a single leaf of lettuce, is performed with attention. Each act is a contribution to the broader rhythm of the monastery, a piece of a system that sustains hundreds of lives. The monk's labor extends beyond food. Water management is a constant concern. Wells, cisterns, and channels require maintenance. Fires must be carefully banked at night. Utensils must be cleaned and stored, ovens swept, and floors scrubbed. The tasks are never finished, yet there is pride in the monotony. The monks understand that their work, though hidden from history and unglamorous, is foundational. The abbey's survival depends on them. They sustain not only the community, but its ideals, its rituals, and its reputation. Guests pose special challenges. Monasteries along pilgrimage routes or trade roads must prepare additional meals, often without warning. Bread, ale, and vegetable stews are produced in greater quantity, with careful attention to consistency. Every meal reflects the monastery's discipline and hospitality, yet the monks themselves rarely eat these enhanced meals. Their austerity persists. Their labor nourishes others, while their own needs remain minimal. a quiet sacrifice that defines their daily lives. As evening approaches, the kitchen slows. Fires are banked, cauldrons cleaned, floors swept, tools are hung or stored. The aroma of salt, herbs, and smoke lingers. Monks meditate briefly on their work, understanding its cyclical nature. Tomorrow will bring the same rhythm, the same duties, the same demands, and still they endure. This quiet endurance is the backbone of monastic life. History may never record the hours spent kneading bread, chopping vegetables, tending fires, or measuring salt. Yet without such labor, the abbeys would not survive. Pilgrims would go hungry. Sacred rituals would falter. Even in silence, there is purpose. The rhythm of labor, the careful measurement of food, the precise tending of fire and water, is a meditation in itself. Each monk contributes to an invisible network of survival, ensuring the spiritual and physical life of the community. The question lingers, as it always does, in lives devoted to quiet service. How many unnoticed hands are required to maintain a single day? And if survival itself is a form of devotion, does it matter that the world outside never remembers these lives? Night falls across the abbey like a soft cloak. Candles gutter in the high windows, flickering against the cold stone walls. The gardens are dark and still, the air filled with the faint scent of herbs and dew. Inside, the kitchen is quiet for the first time in hours. Fires have been banked, cauldrons scrubbed, tools hung in their designated places, floors swept and mopped with care. The smell of bread, smoke, and salt lingers, a faint memory of the day's labor. For the kitchen monks, the day is over, but the significance of their work is anything but complete. They have sustained hundreds of lives through repetitive, unremarkable actions: kneading dough, chopping vegetables, stirring soups, measuring salt, tending fires, and hauling water. To outsiders, the day may appear monotonous or even trivial. To those who live within the monastery walls, it is the foundation of survival, ritual, and spiritual practice. The abbot, a stern yet thoughtful man, passes through the hall to inspect the kitchens one last time. He nods to the conversee quietly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than praise. Formal recognition is rare. Discipline and humility are valued above applause. Still, the subtle nod carries weight. The abbot knows the monastery would collapse without these men, their work invisible, their contributions unrecorded in chronicles or annals. Gaius's equivalent here is the cellarer, a senior kitchen monk named Brother Anselm. He has spent decades perfecting the balance between scarcity and abundance. He knows precisely how much flour remains in the barrels, how many salted herring are stored for winter, and the condition of every herb bundle in the drying racks. Every decision he makes has immediate consequences for hundreds of lives. Yet, like the countless monks before him, he is mostly unseen. Visitors admire the abbey's towering walls, its ornate chapel, or the discipline of its chanting monks. They rarely notice the meticulous organization that makes it all possible. And the monks themselves do not seek recognition. They labor because survival, sustenance, and obedience are sacred in their own right. The night is long and cold. In the winter months, water freezes in the cisterns, and the stone floors chill to an almost unbearable temperature. Yet, even in the late hours, one monk remains near the hearth, adding logs to maintain warmth, checking the ashes, ensuring that the ovens will be ready for bread at dawn. This is the rhythm of monastic labor. Work extends beyond the visible day, and vigilance is continuous. Some novices grumble quietly, their hands stiff from hauling wood or scrubbing pots. Others, seasoned by years of repetition, move with calm efficiency, understanding that the monastery's survival depends on every small act. No gesture is too trivial, no chore insignificant. Each becomes a thread in the fabric of communal life. Preparation for the next day begins almost immediately. Even in the dark, Herbs are sorted and bundled for morning meals. Cauldrons are inspected, emptied of ashes, and scraped clean. Bread that will bake at dawn is set aside, already formed, rising slowly under linen cloths. Salt and grains are measured and recorded, carefully noting what remains and what must be sourced from nearby villages or trade. The work is cyclical, unending, and entirely dependent on the discipline of human hands. The monastery's endurance relies on these silent labourers, and the quality of life of every monk, guest, and pilgrim hinges upon their diligence. Some evenings, Brother Anselm pauses to reflect. Leaning on a wooden table, wiping sweat from his brow, he observes the empty hall, the carefully stacked firewood, the meticulously arranged ingredients, and the gleaming pots now resting silently on hooks. The kitchen is spotless, orderly, and ready. It is both a testament to his labour and a symbol of continuity. In these moments, he senses the impermanence of his work. Bread will be eaten. Herbs will dry and decay. Pots will be used and scoured clean again. Yet impermanence does not diminish value. The monastery functions, endures, and survives precisely because of this ephemeral labour. Each small action is a thread in a greater pattern, largely invisible to the eyes of history, but essential to the existence of the community. Feast days and special occasions amplify the labour. Pilgrims arrive, abbots visit, and the kitchen must accommodate increased demand. Extra bread, larger stews, and rare delicacies must be prepared without error. Monks work from dawn until after Vespers, sweating, slicing, stirring, and carrying, often with little rest. Yet even these extraordinary efforts are met with silence. The purpose is not applause, it is service, and in the silence there is a quiet satisfaction. The monastery functions, lives are nourished, and spiritual practice continues unbroken. Labour itself becomes a form of devotion. Each loaf, each cauldron of soup, each bundle of herbs is a prayer expressed in action. The physical demands are immense. Kneading dough for hundreds of loaves strains the arms and back. Carrying water from cisterns to cauldrons chills the body in winter. Constant attention to fire, boiling liquids, and sharp knives requires vigilance and precision. The work is never-ending and leaves little time for reflection. Yet in repetition, there is a rhythm, almost a meditation. Monks develop muscle memory and intuition over time. A seasoned kitchen monk can judge the heat of a fire by the colour of the coals, the readiness of bread by its crust, and the freshness of vegetables by subtle changes in texture or smell. These skills are rarely written down or celebrated. They exist in quiet competence, passed down from one generation to the next. Yet the labour is not entirely mechanical. Decisions are constant. How much salt for preserving cabbage? Which herbs should be used today? How should the day's bread be apportioned for the pars, monks, and for pilgrims? Each choice, however small, carries consequences. Miscalculation could lead to scarcity, spoilage, or even illness. Each monk's judgment and experience directly affect the survival and well-being of the community. This combination of repetition, skill, and responsibility defines the monastic kitchen. It is a place of discipline and devotion, survival and service, where physical labour intertwines with spiritual purpose. The monotony is not dull, it is essential. Without it, the rhythm of monastic life collapses. Even as the centuries pass, the memory of these labours remains mostly invisible. Chronicles record abbots, bishops, and events of political or spiritual significance. Rarely do they mention the men who kneaded bread, salted fish, chopped vegetables, or tended fires, yet without them, those events would never have been possible. The monastery, like the broader sweep of history, depends on the invisible foundation. The silent endurance of those who labour without recognition sustains not only daily life, but the continuity of culture, faith, and community. As the final embers of the fire die down, Brother Anselm leans on his wooden stool, surveying the orderly kitchen. There is satisfaction in the completion of the day's work, but also an awareness of its continuity. Tomorrow will demand the same precision, the same effort, the same silent devotion, and the day after that, and the day after that. He closes his eyes for a moment, listening to the echoes of the day, the clatter of pots, the splash of water, the crackle of fire. Each sound is a thread in the fabric of the monastery, woven invisibly but indispensably. In the quiet, he reflects on the invisible truth. The monastery endures not because of grandeur or glory, but because of routine, discipline, and the unseen labor of ordinary hands. Each loaf baked, each cauldron tended, each measure of salt preserved the lives and faith of hundreds. And yet, the question remains, as it has for centuries. If such labor is entirely uncelebrated, entirely hidden from history, is it any less important? Can survival, routine, and discipline themselves constitute a legacy? In the kitchen, the answer is clear. Life continues, the abbey thrives, and the work is done faithfully. History may overlook the hands that sustain, but the world endures because of them. The monks of the kitchen leave no grand monuments. They leave no stories in chronicles, but they leave life itself. Silence falls. The abbey sleeps. Fires have burned low. The smell of bread, herbs, and salt lingers faintly, a whisper of labor and devotion. The kitchen rests, knowing that at dawn the lamps will be lit again, the cauldrons stirred, and the rhythm of survival will resume. And so it always has, and so it always will. Before the first light of day touches the hills of northern Italy, the workers are already stirring. They do not rise to the sound of a bell or the command of a magistrate, but to the steady rhythm of necessity. The road must be built. Their tools, hammers, chisels, picks, and shovels lie beside their straw mats, waiting for the hands that will guide them. The foreman, a veteran soldier named Lucius Aemilius, walks quietly among them. His sandals scuff the dirt floor of the temporary encampment. He checks the placement of each tool, nods at a pair of men sharpening their picks, and watches as others fill buckets with water from a nearby stream. He does not speak loudly. Command in this labor-intensive work is more about timing, precision, and observation than about orders shouted across fields. The men are mostly millets, soldiers conscripted for construction duty rather than combat, but some are local laborers, hired seasonally from villages along the planned route. They are a mix of young and old, strong and wiry, disciplined and stubborn. All understand the task: to carve a durable road across hills, valleys, and rivers, a ribbon of the stone that will serve Rome for centuries. The construction of a Roman road is not a simple matter of paving. It is a science of layers, drainage, and alignment. First, the route is surveyed carefully. Wooden stakes mark the line. The slope and elevation must be precise to prevent water damage. The workers begin by clearing vegetation and leveling the earth. This initial stage consumes days of heavy labor, with picks and shovels biting into soil and rocks. Teams hauling debris to the sides. Water must be managed meticulously. Streams may be diverted, ditches dug to carry runoff, and embankments reinforced. In winter, rain-soaked earth becomes mud that slows the men and threatens collapse. In summer, the heat bakes soil into hard clods, making excavation a slow, punishing process. For every step forward, there is effort measured in sweat and bruised hands. Stones are collected from nearby quarries, broken into manageable sizes, and transported with levers, sleds, or sheer human strength. The sound of hammer against rock echoes across the hills, punctuated by grunts of exertion and occasional cursing. Lucius moves among the men, inspecting progress. He checks that trenches are straight, that stones are well fitted, that drainage is adequate. Small mistakes at this stage will be costly, A road that pools water will crack, warp, and crumble within years. The durability of the road depends entirely on precision, patience, and repetition. The kind of work that leaves no lasting fame but ensures Rome's control over its provinces. Each man knows his place. Teams are divided. Some dig, some haul, some shape stones. One group lays the foundation, a bed of compacted gravel, leveled with care. Another places larger, flat stones to form the core of the road. Yet another smooths the top layer, arranging tightly fitted paving stones, often polished slightly by years of wear, but still requiring exact placement. The labor is relentless. The day begins before dawn and stretches long into the afternoon, sometimes past sunset in summer. Meals are simple: bread, cheese, vegetables, and occasionally salted pork or fish. Salt, as in the monasteries, is a precious commodity, used sparingly to preserve meat and flavor food. There is no luxury. Men drink from a stream or from barrels of water carried to the site. There is little opportunity for rest and little conversation. The work is rhythmic, repetitive, demanding full attention. A misaligned stone or a poorly compacted layer can undo hours of effort. Discipline is necessary, but fatigue is constant. Bruises, blisters, and aching backs are common. In winter, frostbite is a concern. In summer, heat stroke. Yet the work must continue. Rome demands it. In addition to physical labor, the men must maintain tools. Picks and chisels dull quickly against stone, hammers chip or break. Maintenance requires careful grinding on stones, sharpening blades, and occasional replacement from the camp's limited supplies. A lost or damaged tool slows progress significantly. Every action, no matter how small, contributes to the success of the project. Some men grumble quietly, resentful of the monotony. Others accept the rhythm, moving with steady patience. Lucius notices the differences, assigning the more resilient men to the hardest tasks, the younger or less experienced to less critical work. Efficiency is not achieved by haste, but by balance, by understanding each worker's capacity, and by directing effort where it is most effective. Road construction is not only physical, but also strategic. The placement of bridges, fords, and culverts requires planning. Stones must be selected for durability, angles for drainage, slopes for cartwheels. Every mile must withstand weather, weight, and time. Roman engineers, often soldiers trained in surveying, oversee the project, but the execution falls to these laborers. Without their endurance, skill, and monotony-tamed focus, the roads would remain theoretical lines on a map rather than lasting infrastructure. Rest is brief and functional. Lunch consists of bread and dried vegetables, eaten under the shade of an embankment or a temporary shelter. Water is rationed to conserve for the long day ahead. Conversation is minimal. Men may exchange grunts or simple instructions. The pace is dictated not by ambition, but by necessity. The work must continue, steadily, meticulously, until the mile is completed, then the next, and the next. Evenings are spent repairing tools, stacking stones, and organizing supplies for the next day. Sleep is often short, interrupted by cold, hunger, or the occasional roar of distant wolves. The laborer's life is disciplined, repetitive, and largely invisible to the larger world. Yet there is pride, however quiet, in the work. A completed section of road is evidence of skill and endurance. The stones lie level, the surface smooth, and the drainage adequate. Horses and carts will traverse this path for decades, perhaps centuries, long after the men have returned to their villages, long after the dust of their labor has settled into memory. Lucius observes the work silently, acknowledging the effort with a nod or brief word of approval. Recognition is rare, often unnecessary. The road itself is the reward, its durability, precision, and utility. Each stone carries the imprint of human effort. The scratches from chisels, the rounded edges worn by hands and hammers, the subtle variations in size and placement, all speak to the careful labor of men working within the constraints of human endurance and available technology. Modern eyes might see the road as a uniform surface, but for those who built it, it is a mosaic of toil, skill, and persistence. The Romans understood the importance of roads not only for commerce and army movement, but for the cohesion of the empire itself. And while emperors and generals receive historical credit, the men who carried stones, dug trenches, and measured inclines are almost entirely forgotten. Yet without them, the empire could not function. As dusk settles, the workers gather for a brief meal before nightfall. The smell of cooking fires drifts through the camp. Conversation is minimal. Some men sharpen tools for the next day. Others stretch aching muscles, their bodies stiff from repeated lifting, bending, and hammering. Lucius walks among them, observing, noting who may be fatigued, who may be in danger of injury. He knows the importance of managing the men carefully. A single injury could halt progress for a day or more. Discipline, patience, and attention to detail are as important as strength. The night is silent, except for the occasional cry of an owl or the rustle of leaves. The campfire burns low. Men lie on straw mats, bodies aching, hands blistered, minds focused on the next day. Sleep comes slowly, disturbed by anticipation, hunger, or the memory of heavy lifting. Yet the work endures. Stones will be laid, trenches dug, and the road will extend further into the landscape. Day after day, mile after mile, the labor continues, shaping not only terrain, but the very cohesion of an empire. And while history will remember generals, governors, and emperors, it will rarely remember these laborers. Their contribution is quiet, invisible, and essential. Without their hands, the roads would crumble, and Rome's reach would falter. Even in exhaustion, there is rhythm, there is order, there is purpose. Each man knows that the next sunrise brings repetition, that the next mile awaits, and that the road must continue to the horizon. And yet, as Lucius watches his men sleeping in the dim light, he wonders quietly, if the empire depends on the unseen toil of hundreds or thousands of men, what happens when the laborers stop? How fragile is a civilization built on stones and sweat, guided by invisible hands? The answer is unknown. But for now, the road stretches forward, solid, enduring, and silent, a testament to endurance, monotony, and the unnoticed labor that holds empires together. The morning sun rises slowly over the foothills, casting long shadows across the cleared earth. Lucius and his men are already at work, their hands raw, muscles stiff, and spirits governed by the rhythm of labor rather than enthusiasm. The road stretches ahead, a ribbon of potential, yet it is only as good as the care given to every stone, every layer, and every drainage channel. Surveying continues with the same meticulous attention as the previous day. Wooden stakes mark the center line, and men carry measuring rods to ensure straightness over uneven terrain. Slopes are adjusted, low points filled, high points shaved. Even slight miscalculations can result in water pooling on the road's surface, leading to erosion that may take decades to repair, or worse, immediate damage that slows travel and transport. The work is divided among specialized teams. One digs trenches and hauls away excess soil. Another breaks stones into appropriate sizes, using chisels and hammers to shape them. Others lay the foundations, a mixture of sand, gravel, and compacted soil, layer by layer, tamped down with wooden mallets until the surface is firm and even. Paving the road itself is both physically demanding and painstakingly precise. Each stone must fit snugly against its neighbors. Gaps are filled with smaller stones or gravel. Surface layers are leveled and polished slightly with hammers, creating a smooth path for carts, horses, and foot traffic. The repetitive motion lifting, dropping, striking, fitting, leaves hands blistered and backs aching. Yet precision is critical. Summer heat presses down on the laborers, turning soil to dust and baking stone surfaces. Water is rationed carefully. Men carry buckets from streams and wells, balancing the need to stay hydrated with the practicality of conserving limited supplies. Dust coats every exposed surface: hair, skin, and clothing. Faces are streaked with sweat and grime, yet work continues. One misstep, dropping a stone, misaligning a layer, can undo hours of labor. In winter, mud and frost pose a different set of challenges. Frozen ground resists excavation. Stone becomes slick and difficult to handle. Rain and snow turn cleared paths into rivers of sludge. The men labor under heavy cloaks, shivering yet precise, aware that any lapse could compromise the road's longevity. Food is modest. Bread, cheese, and salted vegetables form the bulk of sustenance. Occasionally, salted pork or fish is available, rationed among the men. Meals are functional rather than pleasurable, consumed quickly during short breaks. The labor is continuous, and energy must be preserved. Conversation is limited to instructions, warnings, and the occasional grumble. Monotony is pervasive. The repetitive motions of digging, lifting, breaking, and placing stones dominate the day. Yet, there is a rhythm to it, a cadence that becomes almost meditative. Each stone laid is part of a larger pattern, extending miles across the landscape. There is satisfaction in seeing the road grow steadily, despite the lack of recognition. Lucius moves among the teams, observing, correcting, and guiding. He ensures that drainage ditches are properly angled, that stones are compacted, and that layers are consistent. Experience teaches him when a stone is properly placed, or when gravel is adequately leveled. His oversight is essential. Without his knowledge, the labor could easily result in uneven surfaces, pooling water, or roads that crumble prematurely. Mistakes are costly. If a culvert is improperly angled, rainwater may flood the road. If stones are misaligned, carts will jolt and break. If the foundation is weak, the road may collapse under the weight of soldiers, traders, or travelers. The men understand the stakes, even if history will not remember their names. Bridges and fords add complexity. Crossing rivers requires careful planning. Stone footings must be placed precisely to withstand water flow. Wooden planks, where used, must be fitted and secured. The construction is slow, repetitive, and exhausting, demanding both skill and patience. Each successful crossing is a small triumph. Though no chronicler will record it, the road is more than a path. It is a lifeline for the empire. Soldiers, merchants, messengers, and officials will rely on it. Supply chains, tax collection, and military campaigns depend on its reliability. And yet, the men who make it possible remain mostly invisible, unsung, and unrecorded. Days blend into weeks. Sections of the road are completed mile by mile, each segment a testament to endurance and careful labor. Men develop muscle memory for lifting and placing stones, for tamping gravel, for leveling surfaces. Each strike of a hammer or chisel becomes precise and controlled, guided by experience rather than conscious thought. Even as the labor continues, fatigue accumulates. Blisters, bruises, and aching joints are common. Some men are forced to rest temporarily. Others continue despite pain. Discipline and endurance are as critical as strength. Those who falter can slow the entire crew, yet patience, repetition, and quiet determination ensure progress. The mental demands are subtle but significant. Workers must constantly assess stone stability, anticipate how rain or weight will affect the road, and adjust layers accordingly. Decisions are small but consequential. A slightly raised stone, a poorly compacted foundation, a neglected drainage ditch, all could compromise the road. Every day, Labor is intertwined with observation, calculation, and foresight. Lucius's guidance ensures cohesion. He coordinates teams, monitors progress, and makes adjustments as needed. His experience is invaluable, translating the abstract plans of Roman engineers into practical, achievable actions. Without him, the work would be chaotic, inefficient, and error-prone. Even the smallest details matter. Stones are selected not only for size, but for shape and durability. Gravel must be evenly distributed. Sand or clay used for bedding layers must be free of large debris. Each step requires attention to consistency and quality. One misjudged detail can result in uneven surfaces or rapid deterioration. The men work not only for immediate completion, but for the road's endurance over decades, even centuries. Despite the grueling repetition, there is a quiet satisfaction in the work. Miles of road begin to take shape, following valleys, crossing hills, spanning rivers. Travelers in the future will move more efficiently, armies will march more reliably, and trade will flourish, all thanks to the men who carried stones, dug trenches, and endured hardship. Yet recognition is minimal. Chroniclers record emperors, generals, and governors. Roads appear in maps and itineraries. The laborers remain nameless, uncelebrated, and largely forgotten. Their endurance is silent, their contribution invisible, yet indispensable. Evenings are short and utilitarian. Men repair tools, organize stone piles, and prepare for the next day. Fires are banked, water is stored, and straw mats are arranged for sleep. Conversation is minimal, sleep intermittent, bodies aching from the relentless physical demands. Still, as night falls, the road stands as evidence of their effort. Though unfinished, it embodies precision, endurance, and quiet persistence. Each stone is a testament to human labor, repetition, and discipline. And so the rhythm continues. Every day, mile by mile, stone by stone, the road extends further into the landscape. The labor is monotonous, exhausting, and largely invisible to the world beyond. Yet it is essential. Without these men, the empire's arteries, the roads that allow communication, commerce, and control, would falter. Lucius watches over the sleeping camp, reflecting on the fragility and resilience of their work. The road is durable, yet it depends entirely on human effort. The empire, though vast, is ultimately sustained by small, unseen acts of endurance. Lifting, placing, measuring, repeating, and still, he wonders quietly, if the survival of an empire depends on the unseen labor of countless men, what happens if the rhythm falters? How long can an empire endure if its foundation rests on sweat, repetition, and silent diligence rather than glory? The answer remains unknown. For now, the road continues forward, mile by mile, enduring silently under the hands of the laborers who build it. The sun rises again, pale and steady, over the finished section of the via. The men wake in their temporary shelters, their bodies aching from weeks of continuous labor. Blisters have hardened, muscles are sore. Yet there is an unspoken understanding. The work they have done matters beyond the immediate effort. It matters for survival, for commerce, for armies, for the future of an empire. Lucius walks along the stretch of road completed yesterday, inspecting each stone. The surface is smooth, the layers solid, and the drainage ditches precisely aligned. It is, by the standards of Roman engineering, excellent work. He notices small imperfections, slightly uneven stones, gaps barely visible, but he knows that the road will endure decades, perhaps centuries. The imperfections will fade under wheels, hooves, and weather. For the laborers, there is no fanfare, no ceremony, no public praise. Their work will be appreciated by travelers, soldiers, and merchants who will never know their names. And yet, There is a quiet pride in accomplishment. The road is tangible evidence of human endurance, patience, and skill. Every stone laid, every ditch dug, every slope corrected, is a testament to their diligence. Road building is not glamorous, but it is essential. The success of the empire